Dr. Andreja Zevnik je profesorica kritične globalne politologije. To je zdaj prevod Critical Global Politics, torej ne vem, kako se to pravilno prevaja v slovenščino, na univerzi v Manchesteru. Njeni raziskovalni interesi segajo od tem o rasizaciji in marginalizaciji prikrajšanih skupnosti do širših vprašanj politične mobilizacije za rasno pravičnost. Na podlagi kritične rasne teorije, postkolonialne teorije, psihoanalize in politične filozofije preučuje, kako rasizem in druge oblike drugosti in izključevanja vplivajo na sposobnost ljudi, da se organizirajo in zagovarjajo svoje pravice. In posebej se osredotoča na raziskovanje romskih skupnosti po Evropi ter afroameriških skupnosti v Združenih državah Amerike. Dr. Andrew Russell pa je profesor politologije na univerzi v Liverpoolu. Obsežno je pisal o volitvah, političnih strankah in politični participaciji težko dosegljivih skupin, zlasti mladih in marginaliziranih skupnosti. V svojem najnovejšem delu raziskuje vpliv politične in družbene izključenosti na vsakdanje življenje marginaliziranih skupnosti, še posebej romskih skupnosti v Evropi. Pisal pa je tudi o političnih pravicah romske skupnosti v Sloveniji, politikah in okvirih EU za vključevanje Romov ter medijskih reprezentacijah in še mnogo drugih tem. Skratka, kot je že prej povedala naša direktorica, z Andrejo in Andrewjem sodelujemo zdaj že okrog 10 let, se mi zdi. Naše sodelovanje sicer nikdar ni bilo formalizirano, čeprav imamo v načrtu tudi prijavo skupnega projekta in pisanje skupnih člankov. Skratka, poznamo se že dolgo časa in redno se srečujemo, si izmenjujemo informacije, tako da mislim, da v tem času bi lahko rekla že, da je naše sodelovanje preraslo na neko vrste prijateljstvo. In sem zelo vesela, da sta danes tukaj z nami. Tukaj sta pa z nami tudi zato, oziroma bosta ob tej priložnosti predstavila svoje razmišljanja, ki sta jih vključila v svojo najnovejšo knjigo z naslovom The Politics of Unbelonging, Understanding and Challenging Racialisation of Roma in Europe and Beyond. Kaj točno je zapisano v tej knjigi, pa prepuščam zdaj besedo vama. Andreja, izvoli.
Thank you, Romana. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. We are both, absolutely delighted to be here. To get us just before we start, we were hoping to have books for a number of people in this room. The books are somewhere, hopefully in the air by now. So the luggage has been lost, and so we have only a couple of copies with us. So one is circulating around. So the way we thought about doing this presentation today is first I'm gonna talk a little bit about the theoretical framework of the book, what we consider to be one of the key issues, so the question of unbelonging, or how can we theorize unbelonging. Andrew will then continue talking about examples, really, focusing on European Union and the EU policies, and then the media representations, and then I'll hopefully still within time give us a quick wrap up and kind of going forward, look into the future. What does it mean to think about belonging, politics and belonging in the terms of Roma community more broadly. Also, I'd like to thank, we have here Susanna, and I'm really, really grateful for Susanna to be here. Susanna is a colleague, friend, and a PhD student here in the University of Ljubljana, who has contributed this photo for the book cover. So thank you so much. Right, so let's start with belonging then. All right. So really, as I said, the core idea of this book, and it took us a while to figure out what is it about. First we thought, maybe it's about rights, maybe it's about law, maybe it's about human rights, and who doesn't have those rights. However, when we were researching on Roma for a few years, we started thinking, well, actually, it's not the questions that, or the difficulties that Roma communities are facing don't necessarily have to do with law, but with the way some of those rights are practiced and the way various political structures, social structures and attitude frame or behave towards the Roma community. Hence why we move towards a more, let's say, or a less tangible idea such as belonging. So belonging in humanities, social sciences is a, is a highly contentious concept. I mean, there are numerous schools of thought which, develop the notions of belonging, but the main distinction, I guess, is between belonging as it's defined or practiced by a nation or a community. Here we can also think about citizenship, as one of the kind of markers of belonging, or belonging around the kind of let's say, the essentialized categories such as race, class, religion, gender, or sex. However, there is also the other side, which is significantly more transitory, to put it that way, whereby individuals or groups travel through different experiences of belonging and can attach themselves to different groups depending on where you are in a particular time, depending on perhaps a grievance or a political interest that perhaps you have. So while the first account is much more rigid and really essentializing, it's also one which a nation state really finds easier or easiest to adopt. Whereas the second one, of course, is significantly more, like, as I said before, tangible, porous, and a bit kind of more difficult also to conceptualize. So the citizenship is one form of belonging. So citizenship is one form of belonging for the state. The second, as it more transitory, is central when we speak about the Roma communities, however, because it kind of, for us at least, it marks a particular internalized nation-state discourse and also logics of racialization that are present in the society. And this second account kind of strives to develop, at least in the way we will go about it in the book, it also aims to develop alternative notions of belonging. So those in relation to a Romani nation or notions which do away with the limits of a nation state. So if, in that sense, if the politics of belonging is essentially a contested topic, much less, and really, I mean, written about a lot, much less has been said about the politics of unbelonging, and this is kind of the argument that we make in the book. Now, the framework of unbelonging that we propose is analytically deeper than the aforementioned accounts. While we understand that it's transitory, both in a way belonging and unbelonging, individual or communal, people in it experience this to belonging and unbelonging daily, and they experience it depending on their intimate or immediate social and political environments. They acknowledge that unbelonging can simply mean, so we acknowledge that unbelonging can mean simply not belonging. However, conceptually, we argue there is something more in it. And the way we, just leave this, yeah. And the way we kind of try to taxonomize this. So this is kind of the difference between belonging and unbelonging. And the way we kind of try to show it is to focus at certain key ideas when it comes to what does it mean to be, a citizen of a state, or what does it mean to be an equal member in a society? So we looked at, say, citizenship, we look at rights, we look at structural racism, we look at agency, violence, mobilizing potential, and critical view. So we think that when one is to speak about what is, so for if you have to think, why do you belong to a community, right? All these ideas that are at the top row become important. And for us, the difference between belonging and unbelonging is that, of course, if you look at citizenship, a person who is belonging to a community has the citizenship rights. The person who is unbelonging to a community can have, and actually in most cases have citizenship rights as well, but sometimes they might not. In terms of human rights, of course, we know that law should not discriminate on paper, but both groups who are belonging and those who are not belonging both have same political rights or similar political rights, but in practice or the way they are perhaps exercised can be different. The question about structural racism is that those groups who are considered to belong do not experience forms of structural racism. However, those who are unbelonging are often exposed to structural racism or to racializing logics that persist or that are put in place or are performed in a society. In terms of agency, and I think this is potentially a really important element, here we talk about political agency and having agency to change or to act politically or to perform or to promote one's rights. Is that in belonging, of course, people have that agency to advocate for their rights. However, in unbelonging, agency is political change is often done to these communities. So these communities becomes much more like objects to it, that are being managed by those who are, for example, who have agency. That does not mean that these communities are powerless. That actually does not mean that at all. And this is why, in the latter part of the book, we are looking at how Roma do organize in different political contexts in Europe, but actually also more broadly, because we do acknowledge that they are very different politically, very different mobilizing contexts in which Roma perform their rights across the globe. And finally, it's not finally yet. In relation to violence, here we talk about structural violence. We don't necessarily mean individual violence here, but it's a violence which can be very latent or very invisible. However, what we say is that violence is possibly the defining feature between belonging and unbelonging. Because if belonging is characterized by the absence of structural or institutional, but also individual violence to an extent, the unbelonging is very much marked by the increased possibility for the subjects to be exposed to all forms of violence. So unbelonging makes groups significantly more visible, and that visibility increases and exacerbates violence. And I think this for us is a very important element in how we distinguish between belonging and unbelonging. We would say that if one is to say that groups do not belong at all, we would say that they are also not particularly politically visible. However, with unbelonging, so this third category, if you want to call it that way, the social and political environment makes these groups explicitly visible, and then becomes a question, this is what we then go in the book on to talk about, how is that visibility then shown in various contexts. And then finally, unbelonging is also marked by a potential to organize oneself or one's politics differently. So if the mobilizing potential under belonging often results in nativism or nationalism, so I think this we also need to be quite clear that if we are talking about belonging and mobilizing potential, we often talk about nationalisms, we talk about nativisms, we talk about various supremacies of different kinds. So nativism highlights and emphasizes difference as something external and undesirable, whereas in contrast, unbelonging challenges this homogenizing nativist logics and instead enhances kind of pride in the difference. So we're not saying that that the unbelong community does not have a sense of self, a sense of community, perhaps sometimes also quite exoticized a sense of self-identity. But what we are saying is that actually the important element in that is that this community also kind of features or embeds or creates a form of pride around its own identity. So thus, if we are to summarize, the main difference between belonging and unbelonging across these different categories, we could say is that the unbelong group are not ignored by state institutions. They're not ignored by the majority, they're not ignored by any other groups. Instead, their visibility is secured through citizenship, special rights, minority representative bodies, and all this, so citizenship, special rights, minority bodies, all these instances highlight this group's difference. It makes the difference visible, be that in the systems of political representation, in the media, in relation to the majority, or in how majority imagines belonging to the nation state. And with such highlighted difference comes an increased possibility of violence. These groups are not immune to nativist attacks, to racism or discrimination in all spheres of social life. And as research on the experience of Roma communities shown, Andrew will talk a little bit about this. We are seeing an increase and an increased forms of violence or aggression towards any kind of difference across Europe. Thus, in as much as Unbelonging offers possibilities of organizing one's life outside the nativist or state-focused logics, such possibilities can also feel precarious and dangerous. And as a result, while transformative, we need to remain conscious and mindful of the risk that also the unbelong groups take to build a different sense of identity, community, and belonging. The reason why we say this is that often we would say at least academics, we love to do that. We tend to glorify somebody's struggle, right? And say, well, do more of this. Put your life out there, protest, risk. But rarely is there an acknowledgement that there is a risk. There is an actual risk to life that the organizers and the communities experience daily. And finally, although I think I might skip this. This is a bit a slightly better or more elaborate worked out table in relation to how can we distinguish or what are the conditions between belonging and unbelonging. So if we just look at actors, for example, in belonging, so the actors who from, right? So in terms of belonging, it's international organization, state, majority, and it's also Roma towards other Roma. So here, what we are looking at is who can perform a sense of belonging and a sense of unbelonging. And the reason why you see Roma in a lot of upper category as well is that, of course, like in every community, there is also a sense of belonging and building belonging in the Roma community itself. That means that, of course, racialization and hierarchies between who is a better Roma, for example, exist within the community itself. So we're trying to show that this is not just a distinction between us and them, a majority and Roma community, or majority and any community that performs any form of difference, but rather that, in different contexts, these are logics that embody, that are present in every kind of a society. It's just that we, in this context, we kind of talk about Roma. I will finish with this, and Andrew, I'll give you the floor to talk about how this is manifested in two particular political instances. Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. We can return to this. Of course, in the Q&A as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Right. Okay. So as Andreje says, then we want to talk about moments where this phenomena of unbelonging becomes visceral, and in the book we do this in a couple of ways, and I have a rather large kind of confession, mea culpa, to make here now. Right, as a British person, I feel very uncomfortable criticising the European Union. Right, the greatest act of self-harm in my lifetime has happened in my country. I'm reminded of it every time I go through Schiphol Airport and I have to join a different queue. A different queue to my luggage, it turns out, but which didn't even get into a queue, but there we go. I'm also going to highlight, when we look at some media representations, some work that we've done looking at Slovenian media, and we don't want to be seen as critical of the Slovenian state, those really nice liberal academics that set up the constitution, that read the political theory that said that you need these special protections for these groups, and the Slovenian state is unique in the protections that it gives to its national minorities and its special cases, but it goes out of its way to make autochthonous Roma a special case, and that is So lots of academics will talk about Roma as being invisible or not noticed, right? We want to say it's the very opposite. There's a visceral visibility, right? And actually what's remarkable about what we think of belonging is that states go out of their way to give a special characterization to Roma in Europe and beyond. Okay, so, but please don't think that I'm anti-European, particularly don't think that I'm anti-Slovenian. Okay, so one of the key chapters, we look at the Europe as a whole, and we use Europe as a kind of shorthand for the continent, the European Union, the European Commission, the European Parliament, Council of Europe, etc., etc. And there's a determination on the part of Europe to reduce the outcome gaps between Roma and non-Roma. Now, 2 decades long, they noticed that Roma were the key losers in all of the kind of the demographics. So in terms of health outcomes, in terms of employment outcomes, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of educational outcomes, all of that, you know, was showing that one group was disadvantaged, and Europe has been determined to try and reduce those gaps. Repeatedly calls Roma the largest minority in Europe. It's never quite clear who the second largest minority in Europe is, but we know that Roma are the largest. And Roma are an issue in every single member state of the European Union, for instance. But it's also key, we think, that they are an issue for the member states, right? So Roma issues, Roma problems are projected, because of the federal structure, projected back to the member states to solve. And there's often a kind of difficulty in how this is then implemented. So the frameworks for Roma inclusion, 20 years of this stuff. There's been again, we would say an admirable move from the first one, which just looked at sectoral impact. So looking at outcomes in employment, in education, housing, health, and so Roma do worse than these. Member states need to do better in that. The second framework, which came in 2020, suggested that that the member states needed to do better at tackling the causes of those sectoral kind of imbalances, and really they mean there racism and poverty, and in particular they focus on this thing that the European Union calls anti-Gypsyism. We know that can be a problematic term, and we look at 2 deaths of global citizens to show how this played out differently. European Roma are, as Balabas says, a nation in excess. They're an issue in every member state. Roma in Europe typically have looked at, because they don't have a mother country, because they're a minority everywhere, that they are dependent on international communities, transnational communities, NGOs, the human rights industry to protect and to push their claims. They don't have a native state arguing for them, and that makes a key difference to other minorities. Some Jewish and Romani activists and scholars have tried to make a kind of common cause between things like anti-Semitism. Sorry, I went forward here, but not there. Anti-Semitism and anti-Roma racism, to look at that shared history of suffering, and that is also a key issue. As Andrea said, we want to kind of get away from that exclusively, that notion of suffering. But for instance, in terms of the Holocaust, to say that of course there's a special Jewish story as part of that, but it's not exclusively Jewish, and Roma are part of that. And there has been some success in recent years, but actually it was very late in the day that the Roma Holocaust was acknowledged. So again, how anti-Gypsyism functions is a practice for the reproduction of existing relations of domination. So Roma are distinctly racialized in Europe. There are differences between the racializations of these communities in Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Europe becomes really interested in Roma when Roma from Central and Eastern Europe start pitching up in Western Europe, right? So it becomes a particular issue when Roma from the succession countries start pitching up in France and Britain and to a lesser extent Italy. And there, of course, are differences in racializations of these communities, and they are communities, not a single community. Okay. But it is that kind of that otherness which we think is important. We claim that Roma are the unbelonged community in Europe, acutely placed or imagined as external to the European civilizing narratives, but almost entirely within European boundaries. Okay. So I'm just going to show you. Look, this is the definition of in the framework of what member states have to do according to Europe. The first objective of the second framework is that by the end of 2030, by the end of the decade, member states will have had to not just looked at those sectoral outcomes in education, health and housing, but will have had to look at the views of the majority towards Roma populations and improve relationships there to decrease public racism, if you like. And I'm just going to skip through this really quickly, just show you a little bit of data to show that throughout Europe, this is a problem. How uncomfortable we feel if majority children had Roma classmates. We can see that throughout Europe, there's a lot of hostility to that notion. So the member states, according to Framework 2, need to reduce those blue sections of discomfort. Okay, sorry, the red sections of extreme discomfort. Again, that's the EU 27 on that. And if we somewhat unfairly want to highlight some of the data on Slovenia from the Eurobarometer, you can see that perception of discrimination is widespread throughout Europe, and Slovenia has an awareness that there is discrimination towards Roma that's pretty widespread. The number of respondents who would be totally uncomfortable with Roma with a Roma in high elected positions, such as the president, Slovenians are slightly more uncomfortable with that than Europe as a whole, and more hostile to a Roma person than any other of the distinctions that they're asked about here. Right? So transgender person, lesbian, gay or bisexual person, different ethnic origin other than the majority, and there's a big gap between people who don't want somebody from a different ethnic origin and specifically a Roma person. Different religion, somebody who's perceived as old or as young or with a disability or a woman, all of those demographics, Roma are showing up worse. This isn't particularly a problem here. Work discrimination, again, Slovenia is aware of it. Whether working or not, how comfortable would you feel if a colleague at work with whom you're in daily contact belonged to each of the following groups? Nearly 3/5 of Slovenians who were asked this question expressed discomfort with coming into daily contact with a Roma person at work. Okay, and again, that's so. This is the kind of challenge that we set. Okay, again, you don't want them in your family. School lessons should not include Roma. There is evidence that Slovenian people are actively engaged and want Roma kids to be integrated into mainstream education. They just don't necessarily want them going to the schools that their kids go to. Right, so a lot of this is mediated from the general to the specific. Right? Okay, right. Back to European level. Just want to highlight two instances to show you how some of this can become problematic. So you may be familiar with both of these stories. You'll certainly be familiar with one of them. 25th of May 2020, George Floyd, African American, was murdered. Was murdered in the United States. Caused global outrage. Was captured on video. and that led to mass protests that were global. Europe as a whole was in the vanguard of reacting to that. Within 3 weeks, the European Parliament had held a special session, 16th of June 2020, to consider Floyd's death in a plenary debate. A resolution was issued that made, within 3 days, that made a special condemnation of the murder. Ursula von der Leyen declared the time has come for us to do more than just listen and condemn it, but to talk about racism frankly. We need to confront reality and relentlessly need to fight racism and discrimination. There's no place for this in our society, that's for sure. We have to ask why members of such groups are unrepresented in some areas but overrepresented in poverty. I want to get to the bottom of these questions. They issued a declaration which detailed the horror of Floyd's murder and crucially agreed in that statement that Europe needed to look to itself in 2 specific places. To the plight of European Roma, who were the historic victims of European racism, and to look to Europe's role in the transatlantic slave trade as well, right? So there was a self-awareness in that conversation about Floyd at the European Parliament that's really quite admirable. Of course, you could criticise it for being performative and tokenistic, but nevertheless, within that statement, there is some self-reflection on Europe's place, and they went out of their way to draw Roma into that debate about the outrage of the killing of George Floyd. So far, so admirable. Exactly 1 year later, a Czech man, Stanislav Tomas, a Czech Roma, died whilst being arrested in Tbilisi in the Czech Republic. Exactly 1 year on from that European Parliament statement. He was being apprehended by police. He was clearly drunk, apparently intoxicated or on some drugs. During the arrest, two officers restrained him by holding his feet and whilst another knelt on his neck for more than 5 minutes. And how do I know this? Because it was videoed. Just like George Floyd. Okay. Struggled for 5 minutes, cried out in obvious pain, eventually felt silent and still. Police claimed that he was still alive at this point, but collapsed and died in the ambulance thereafter. So 1 year after, exactly 1 year after the special statement from the European Parliament on the death of George Floyd, there was a chance to look at the death of a Roma individual on European soil. However, the European Parliament took 3 months to discuss the death at all, and the discussion had no discernible outcome. Some key actors ignored the discussion completely. Not a single member of the European Parliament from the Czech Republic took part in the debate. One claimed that it was all to do with some delirious left-wing MEP saying that it hyped it up. Another said that it was part of an anti-Czech crusade. The police officers who arrested Floyd were publicly commended by the Czech police and the Czech Deputy Prime Minister. At the session of the European Parliament where it finally was discussed, the chair of that session happened to be one of the Slovenian members, because they held the chair at the time, said that we had to understand the hard job that police had. And yet, you know, there are obvious similarities, right? If you look at the resolution, which we do dissect in the book, you know, we want to know why they weren't seen as similar effects. It strikes us that there was a notion that it was an attack on a person's specific racial or ethnic origin, and an attack by the apparatus of the state. There's no question of the structural racism that surrounded the discussion about Floyd, about the discussion of Stanislav Tomas. No question about the use of disproportionate force or violence by the Czech police. No record of racial profiling in that action, and the abject failure to even begin to hold a member country to account. We see in marked contrast to what the European Parliament did about George Floyd. For the institutions of Europe, then, Floyd was deemed as being Floyd was deemed as belonging in and to the United States, and the nation state had a responsibility to protect him and those like him, which it failed to deliver on. Tomasz, on the other hand, was from a minority that is clearly seen as not belonging in Europe, or unbelonging in Europe, despite being European and even a national of the state in which he resided and died. His death was deemed unfortunate but self-inflicted. His entire life was characterised as abnormal and undeserving. Sympathy for his death was disproportionately given to the arresting officers, who were apparently forced to deal with the trauma and the difficulty of this unenviable task of controlling a recidivist who was damaging cars, who was out of control. A systematic failure to accept that Romani people like Thomas belong in and to the nations of Europe culminated in the familiar routine with a literal oversight in explaining his death. The Czech Prime Minister claimed that the same fate would have happened to anyone with Thomas's lifestyle and behaviour, and that kind of misses the point, because it's the lifestyle and behaviour that kind of characterised. Such happenstance was most likely to occur in marginalised and racialised groups like among us. A group that had no real sense of loyalty, fealty or understanding from the states in which they lived. States that define them as problems to accommodate and lives to assimilate. A community for whom the Czech Republic and Europe were carceral states, where unbelonging is the natural endemic state of being for Roma. Okay. Lots of people are exercised about what happened to Stanislav Tomasz. Lots of people are aware of it, but it doesn't have that global presence. It didn't have the resonance. It didn't make the impact that George Floyd did, and we wanted to ask why that was the case. So that got us to thinking about, well, how Roma issues are portrayed and framed in the media, and and indeed two of the chapters look at this. I just want to go through a couple of points from that chapter in very minor way here. I'm not going to talk about the individual cases. You'll be much more familiar with these than I am, and we can talk about the detail. We just were interested in how these were portrayed. So there were, in particular, four kind of incidents from nearly 2 decades where we saw things that were just being repeated and referred to, particularly stuff like Ambrose, which then becomes a touchstone for all future relations between the majority and the minority. Let's go. And in the book we go through quite a detailed kind of thematic analysis of some issues. So we look at coverage over 7 years of media stories from a range of sources, and there are dates there, and we've grouped them into kind of themes. Some of these stories are positive. Some of these stories are showing positive role models in the Romani community. Some of them are not. I'll give you one example because it's a little bit obscure. The thing we've called the pitchfork pensioner. There was a disagreement between an elderly person and a group of Roma, and we never found out the numbers. There was an altercation. It culminated in fines for both the Roma and the majority pensioner. The pensioner was fined for throwing a pitchfork at the Roma people who were near to his land. But the way that this was reported, that you could tell who were the victims and who were the transgressors, right? And if you go below the line in particular, you can see that the fact that the pensioner couldn't afford to pay the fine was a cause of national shame. The fact that the Roma had fines imposed on them that nobody expected them to pay because they were Roma was actually a sign of the transgression of that group, and how. Lots and lots of examples. The truth of which may be elusive in each of these cases. However, whilst collecting these media stories, there's a deep-seated tendency to frame the way that Roma are presented in stories about Roma. Firstly, that they are problems for the majority. So harking back to the firebombing of Roma settlements, police go into those to be seen to be protecting the majority population, to reassure the majority population that they've got control on the hate crime that's going on in there. So there's a kind of externality that's important there. Right? The mere presence of Roma is an increasing challenge to the lifestyles of the majority, whether in terms of health or property. Roma constitute a security risk. Once we get to COVID, and which we do highlight in this chapter, you can see that throughout Europe coming home to roost, right? So lots of the old stories about unsanitary conditions and squalor and disease and disease spreading and the risk to other people come out in very familiar ways through the new lens of COVID. Negative associations of Roma, ritualized depictions of Roma lives and experience repeat. These are dominated by adverse connotations. Roma tendencies for crime, law breaking, antisocial behaviour, fraud, robbery, drugs, prostitution, violence, tax evasion, rudeness, poor hygiene, squalor, untrustworthiness. The transgressions of of acceptable norms and irredeemable universal character flaws are routinely put on this group in the public discourse, in the way things are framed, even in the very positive images of Romani individuals, right? So the story about which we make much of in the book, the Roma matriarch who was a shining example to her community, who was controlling her boys, but also lived in a very neat and tidy settlement, and everything in her house was neatly folded according to the report. Right? Those tropes only make sense if you know what you're supposed to think about Roma. Right? So even the positive images, right, often only serve to kind of reinforce notions of otherness and what we call unbelonging. There are several tropes, but particularly below the line in much of these media stories, of resentment and replacement theory, right? And that people who aren't subject to the same rules as us. And these tropes are so overwhelming, so familiar, that they scarcely need exposition. The upshot of all of them is to conclude that not only is it difficult for Roma to feel a sense of belonging, but also that the pervading environment forces Roma into a particular state of unbelonging, where efforts can never be enough to deserve acceptance. Always pressure on the good Roma to explain why they're not like those other transgressors who you've thought about. And this then creates this kind of internal hierarchy, this internal kind of notion of this internal notion of good and bad, and difference within within Roma kind of representation. Okay, so a bit of a rush through that, but we found this, and again, Slovenia here is an example, an exemplar, not a special case, but just to try and show how those concepts of what we call unbelonging just run through all dealings with Roma. Roma problems are generally presented as a problem for the majority, but it's for Roma to solve, right? And when you come back to how the European Union is looking at the framework, it's interesting that the European Union is now saying it's for member states to solve the problems with the majority, and there seems to be some way to go to do that. So we then started to think about, well, what would a possible more positive set of imaginaries look like? And I'll hand back over to Andreja.
Yeah, so it's really just a quick wrap up, because I know we're running out of time as well. It's also to say that so the last kind of 2 chapters of the book really try to then think about what are those what else is out there ultimately. How else can we think about mobilizing? How else can we think about Roma rights or political organizing of or social organizing of Roma communities? And so and so in a way we had to look beyond Europe. And I mean, this is, of course, this is not a one-size-fits-all, but it is this inevitable, issue, kind of a puzzle that you have is, well, is it better to advocate for one's own rights, right? To showcase or to really amplify one's difference and claim rights on one's difference? Or is it better to build communities, to build alliances with other groups? To think about, who else, how else might one achieve a particular goal? So to focus on goals, so like beating, overcoming poverty, kind of a certain form of social acceptance, addressing unemployment or housing or whatnot, right? But through kind of so focusing on the end goals rather than an identity. And we saw some of that happening in Latin America. So Latin America has actually a vast group of a large group of Roma that have started coming to Latin America from actually the end of the later stages of colonialism, and they have a very different kind of a set of Romani groups. And what they did is, specifically in Brazil and Colombia, what they did is they created, or they started through this, the declaration of the other son of Pachamama, or the Companhia Roma. They started to use the rights that were won by indigenous community and what they call the Afro-descendants. And those rights particularly pertain or concern land and the right to land. Now, of course, this is a little bit of a mismatch, because ultimately, in Latin America, Roma communities are continuously more kind of still traveling, but yet with local councils, they managed to achieve. They draw on the rights of that were won by indigenous and Afro-descendants, and through those rights, they managed to achieve that. The municipality has now in place a plan, particular piece of land where these communities can continue to live, whether or not they are there at that particular time. And I think this is an element of how does one build the coalitions. Similarly, we are seeing that some Roma activists in Europe have kind of reach out towards the Black Lives Matter in the aftermath of Stanislav Tamás to try and build a coalition, to try and build some form of a movement in its aftermath to raise awareness of the Roma rights. It's not been particularly successful, but at least there is a communication and dialogue going on between these activists. What we also see is, Andrew already mentioned, this is a longer project of some Romani leaders. In the US, this has been going on from 1970s onwards, and this is drawing on the experiences of the Holocaust, right? And kind of amplifying how is it that we can make the public aware of the Romani experience of the Holocaust, of the Paraimas. On a different level, we see a number of scholars, activists, artists working on what they call the manifestos, right? So the Ethel Brooks, it's a Europe is Ours. It's a manifesto that was written by a group of academics, and particularly then published by her. This is Romani academics and activists, where they are claiming, when they make again references to kind of the history and slavery, when they make references also to eviction and the historical wrongs that the community experiences. So it's a kind of a very much trying to build an identity that perhaps in a similar line to what we see in critical race theory, what we see in African American political mobilization of, let's say, late 19th century. It's this type of a discourse of of enslavement, of eviction, of transportation that is being mobilized also in Romani discourse today, to kind of also raise awareness as to who Roma were historically and how they perhaps came to Europe, or perhaps what is the history of Roma in the European space. And then perhaps particularly the work of Gosia Mirgatash. So she's a Romani artist from Poland. She represented Poland at Venice Biennale in 2024 with her work on Reenchanting the World, where she is using a very stereotypical Roma depictions in art, kind of using textile to give them a very different meaning, a very different identity. So, this then becomes a question: to what extent do these forms of political actions, social actions, and arts work ultimately, to what extent can they create a different idea, a different representation of the Roma community, not so much necessarily for the outsiders, but rather for the Roma community itself, right? How can it begin to build a sense of pride in the identity? And this is where kind of we finished the book. We kind of thought we need to finish something slightly more positive and something that gives agency really to the Romani community, rather than speaking the entire book in what is being done to the group, right? Which is in itself a problem. So, thank you. Questions?